About 7 years ago, I was approached by a president of a foundation in the US who knew about the work that I was doing. They knew about that, the fact that I was studying the brain from the perspective of large-scale networks. And she was saying she was a bit disappointed with how the field was progressing in trying to understand brain damage and disease from this perspective. Now, at that time, say 7 or some years ago, there's a lot of things happening with new imaging devices that could measure your brain as you're doing stuff in the scanner. Sleeping, eating, moving your feet, moving your toes, thinking about leaving this place and going to get a beer, for instance. But there really wasn't any way of actually pulling it all together. In addition, it wasn't really helping us in terms of understanding clinical conditions. So she said, could you pull together a group that would actually be able to understand brain function in terms of large-scale networks? So I got together with my friend. We were sitting in a pub, and I told him about this conversation. We were sitting there mulling it over and trying to identify people that would be good to work on this thing. I was like, God, this is going to be a hell of a lot of work. We have to get clinicians, we have to get neuroscientists, you have to get engineers, you have to get computer programmers together and have them like each other and talk to each other. And then actually try and collect data that you can actually use. What are we going to do? How are we going to do that? And I said, well, God, it's like we need a virtual brain. And then we have one. So the reason for it is as follows. As I said, you can take your brain, go into a scanner, and get a ton of data collected on it. As a matter of fact, by some estimate, you can get almost 1 terabyte of data on your brain collected in a single session. How much is that? So if we put you into a scanner, for instance, and collected structural information, functional information, and other kinds of structural information. So for example, you can get what's called diffusion tensor imaging, which tells you about connections. You can get gray matter density, white matter density. You can get fMRI, which measures sort of blood flow related activity, but you can also do things like EEG or MEG and measure electrical activity across a period of time. It's 1 terabyte of data. Who has a smartphone here? Pretty much everybody. So your brain would fit on all these smartphones, that data set. It would mean that everybody would have a picture of your brain on their smartphone. The problem is, how do you combine that? How do you take all that data from disparate sources, disparate measures of the brain, and pull it back together? Because the same brain generates all that information. It's critical for brain function. And that's what the virtual brain does. The virtual brain is essentially setting up a dialogue between your brain and the model of your brain. This diagram here is meant to illustrate sort of the cycle that would happen with this software platform. You could take your data, for example, a model of the cortical surface that you'd get from an MRI. You'd also take a model of the anatomical connections that you might capture using diffusion tensor imaging, which is a sort of a surrogate measure for connections in the brain. And then you'd add some interesting maths to that model. There's a lot of work now that has been done in sort of how you generate population level activity using mathematical modeling. So at each of these sites in the brain, you put in a little oscillator, nonlinear oscillator, for example, and then generate data, simulated data. You can generate what you might be able to measure. If you could stick an electrode in the person's brain, they wouldn't squirm. What you might measure if they're doing an fMRI experiment and generating bold activity, or if you put a cap on their head and measured EEG. So you can get the virtual brain to generate the same data that you would measure in a scanner, in modern equipment. And then see how close does that data match what you actually measured. If there's a mismatch, you go back and modify the parameters of the model until you get a better match to the data. So essentially what you're setting up again is a dialogue between your data and the virtual brain until you get a good match between what you've measured in the scanner and what you have inside the virtual brain. So again, it's a dialogue. That's what's different between the virtual brain simulation platform and other modeling efforts you may have heard about. Here we're actually talking about a direct interaction between empirical data and the model. And in doing so, we actually learn a bit more about your brain but also about other brains that go into the model. We can actually make your brain the virtual brain. We can watch it grow up. We can watch it get old. We can give it drugs. We can put it to sleep, for example. We can stimulate it as well with things like TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or deep brain stimulation, or visual stimulation, or other kinds of stimulation. Won't go there today. So that's kind of cool. So you can make an individual's brain the virtual brain. That then means that if you have a patient, you could do the same thing. You could take someone who's had a stroke, for example, on the left, and say, I have information about where the stroke is. I have information that I can gather about the connections that may have been messed up by that stroke. And I can then give the virtual brain the same damage and see what happens there. So in the middle panel there, this is kind of like Where's Waldo diagram. You can look on the right and left halves of that image, to be the right and left hemisphere, and find which dots are missing on the left side. And that tells you where the lesion is when you map the stroke here into this space. And then let the virtual brain generate some data and say what happens if you had an acute stroke, for example. So this person just came into the emergency ward, had a stroke in the left parietal lobe, and what would happen to the computational capacity of their brain. So this last diagram here is showing you the areas that are increasing their communication as a function of the stroke and decreasing the communication as a function of the stroke. So red lines tells you the areas that are increasing their interactions, and blue tells you areas that are decreasing their interactions as a consequence of that damage. So that tells us something very specific about how the brain responds then, at least in principle, to the damage in this individual. It's not just increases, not just decreases, but actually both that happen as a consequence of stroke. So now, we could go in there and poke and prod the virtual brain to see what would we need to do to reestablish a reasonable level of functionality, to reestablish a reasonable pattern of communications that you see in a healthy brain. We could also look at what happens in the natural course of recovery in this individual. So map this person's brain across a number of times and use that to capture the changes that happen in this brain as they recover. And map out where recovery is good, where recovery is bad. And use that again in a therapeutic regime, in principle at least, to see how would we change the brain to help it recover function more quickly and perhaps a higher level of function as well. So it ends up being a platform then to test potential therapies in the virtual environment before you take it to the patient. Essentially like having to provide you a different level of decision support to help you eliminate certain avenues of treatment in favor of other avenues of treatment. It's kind of cool too. The last thing about the virtual brain is that it's an open source platform. The software was released for public consumption in the fall of last year. It runs on a web browser. It runs on all major platforms. It's open source, so anybody can grab it for no cost. It runs on a laptop. It runs on supercomputers. Potentially even an iPad, but we'll see how far we get with that. It's a community project then. So what ends up happening is that anybody who's using that product could in fact contribute to the broader understanding of how the brain works. They can generate their own models and say, hey, when I did this manipulation to the model, look what I got in terms of my data set. And put that into a broader library of models of brain function and models of brain dysfunction. So the virtual brain becomes a new mode of collaboration that allows people to share data in ways that we haven't before. As I mentioned, there's broad initiatives now that are collecting a ton of data. For example, there's the ADNI initiative, Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative in the US. It's been going on for, I think, about 10 years. A lot of data in there on Alzheimer's disease. And this platform could actually help pull that data together to understand changes in the degenerative process that predict certain clinical outcomes. There's large data sets being collected on kids as they mature, large data sets being collected on kids who have developmental disorders as well. This platform can allow collaborations to happen between people who have access to those data sets, but also want to understand what's happening in the brain with normal development, but also in terms of damage and disease, and share that model with the rest of the community. So where are we going with this? So we've had, as I mentioned, we had the first version released in the fall of this past year. I think we're in version 1.04 now, so version 2 will probably be ready in the fall of this year. The things we're looking at right now, obviously, if you can take anybody's brain and put it into this model, it really gives you a better way of understanding individual differences. People are different, you know that. The question are, what is it that contributes to these individual differences in terms of the neuroscience part of it? So we can take anybody's data and put it in there and get a mapping of how individual differences map to behavior. What individual differences are meaningful in terms of differentiating individuals, and what individual differences are less meaningful. So a better idea of capturing individual variability in brain structure and function. The virtual brain is the dialogue, as I said, between your brain and the computer model of the brain. If we can do one brain, why can't we do 2, or 5, or 10, or 20 at the same time? And have the virtual brain actually be the mediator, in some respects, of a dialogue between your brain and your friend's brain, for instance. It can take data in, it can push data out. It can actually be a new model, essentially, for interfaces, brain-computer interfaces, for instance, to allow communication to happen in a way we haven't thought of before. I'm actually going to try something like this in the fall at the Nuit Blanche event in October. So if you've got nothing better to do on Saturday night, first weekend of October, come by the installation for my virtual dream on the corner of University and College. And we'll show you what we mean. There's obviously applications in the clinical domain. I showed you an example of how you might be able to use the virtual brain in terms of tracking damage. Whether it be the acute phase of damage, for example, in terms of stroke and subsequent recovery, being able to use that to map potential courses for recovery of function and potential avenues for treatment. You can also envision being used also in degenerative disorders, MS, Alzheimer's disease, and so forth. One of the groups that's involved in the Virtual Brain Project is in Marseille, where there's a massive epilepsy clinic. And you can envision using the virtual brain to actually help with pre-surgical mapping. There's actually a module in the virtual brain called the epileptor, which puts in a little seizure focus. And you can use that to identify what the likely seizure foci are and what would happen if you actually remove that seizure focus in terms of the rest of the system's capacity to reorient the network to allow recovery of function. The final thing is stimulation. As I mentioned, there are techniques out there that are used to stimulate your brain to help it recover. TMS is one. Deep brain stimulation over Toronto Western is quite popular now in terms of providing treatments for Parkinson's disease, for depression, and potentially also Alzheimer's disease. The funny thing is we have no idea why it works. We know that it does. We don't actually know why. So the virtual brain can actually be a platform then to help you understand stimulation effects, understand how stimulation propagates through the network, and also understand how to tweak stimulation parameters for an individual's brain again to make sure the stimulation is actually working optimally for that person before you go ahead and implant electrodes or do the surface stimulation as well. So a broad set of applications, a lot of things that we can do in the coming year, and we're probably going to do it as well. So it's kind of fun. And so with that, I will thank you for your attention.